In the balmy summer of 1905, on the tranquil grounds of York Cottage nestled within the Sandringham estate, a new royal life began. Prince John Charles Francis, the youngest son of the then Prince and Princess of Wales, later King George V and Queen Mary, entered the world on July 12th as the sixth and final child of the growing Windsor brood. His arrival was met with customary joy, though behind closed doors there may have been a flicker of apprehension, for history had not been kind to royals named John. The name itself was considered a poor omen within British royal circles, ever since the disastrous reign of King John in the 13th century. A monarch so reviled that no subsequent king dared adopt the name. Yet in those early days, little Prince John, affectionately called Johnny by his family and nursery staff, appeared to be a robust and cheerful child. Family letters and memoirs recall a merry, mischievous boy, often the ringleader of pranks in the nursery, and with a penchant for cheeky remarks that left even his stern grandmother, Queen Alexandra, momentarily softened. One oft-repeated anecdote tells of how, after witnessing his mother embrace his father following a hunting trip, the impish child declared, "She kissed Papa, ugly old man," much to everyone's amusement. King George V, though a disciplinarian by nature, doted on his youngest child. In fact, he privately confessed to President Theodore Roosevelt that while all his children were obedient, John was the exception, and he could never quite bring himself to scold the boy. Queen Mary, known for her composure and attention to detail, oversaw her son's upbringing with characteristic care, ensuring his education and etiquette matched those of his siblings. Photographs from the period depict a bright-eyed boy with an engaging, open face, often clutching a toy soldier or perched beside one of the many royal family pets. But as the years passed, cracks began to show in this idyllic image. While his siblings thrived, Prince Edward, Prince Albert, later George VI, Princess Mary, Prince Henry, and Prince George displaying the expected signs of healthy, intelligent young royals, John's development fell noticeably behind. By the age of 4, it became difficult to dismiss the differences. He was slower to speak, struggled to follow instructions, and occasionally stared vacantly, caught in moments of strange, unplaceable detachment. Royal physicians, always attuned to even the slightest irregularity in the bloodline, were quick to notice. While John was described as winsome and affectionate, reports to Queen Mary noted that he was also painfully slow. In an era when medical understanding of neurological conditions was rudimentary at best, such terms masked what modern eyes might now recognize as signs of autism or an intellectual disability. Medical texts of the time used vague and often cruel classifications like simple-minded or feeble-minded, and any deviation from the expected path of royal development was viewed not only as a personal tragedy but as a potential scandal. In 1909, tragedy struck. At just 4 years old, Prince John suffered his first grand mal epileptic seizure. It would have been a terrifying sight, a convulsing, unresponsive child in an age without effective treatment or understanding of epilepsy. The condition, then cloaked in stigma and superstition, was whispered about in high society as a mark of inherited weakness, or worse, divine punishment. For the House of Windsor, which relied upon the illusion of invincibility and physical perfection, this was a terrifying prospect. Physicians, adhering to the discreet protocols of the era, made discreet predictions. The child might not live to adulthood, and if he did, it would be a life shadowed by ill health, unsuitability for public life, and the quiet removal from the royal stage. There were no state-of-the-art neurological specialists, no diagnoses of autism spectrum disorder, and no concept of inclusive care. The most progressive families might make arrangements for their afflicted members in the countryside. Others locked them away in asylums. For royalty, the stakes were higher. The British monarchy's strength rested not only in its constitutional role, but in the imagery it presented to the public: flawless, unassailable, and untroubled by mortal frailties. Behind the heavy drapes of Sandringham House and Buckingham Palace, concern quickly hardened into quiet containment. Queen Mary, a woman of duty and decorum, found herself torn between maternal affection and the ruthless demands of monarchy. Family diaries and correspondence reveal that while she loved her son, she also feared the damage his condition could do to the crown's reputation. In those years, Edwardian society's understanding of mental and neurological disorders was rooted in ignorance and deep prejudice. Any weakness in the bloodline was whispered about as hereditary taint. The notion of an heir or a prince with a developmental disability posed a dangerous threat to the legitimacy of the monarchy itself. It was not simply a private sorrow, it was a public liability. As King George V and Queen Mary ascended the British throne in 1910, the country beheld a royal family carefully curated for the public eye, a dynasty meant to embody Edwardian values of duty, dignity, and unassailable health. But within the gilded walls of Buckingham Palace and Sandringham House, a quiet, growing anxiety took hold. Prince John, the king's youngest son, had begun to slip away from the carefully orchestrated tableau. The first major rupture came in 1911, during the lavish preparations for the coronation of George V. While the nation prepared for a spectacle of imperial grandeur, one name was conspicuously missing from the official plans: Prince John. Behind closed doors, palace physicians and courtiers had deemed it too risky for the tenacious, bright-eyed boy to attend. His epilepsy, poorly understood in Edwardian Britain, presented a danger both to his delicate health and, more critically, to the royal image. The sight of a royal child convulsing in public could have set off whispers of hereditary illness, mental instability, or divine punishment, deeply unsettling notions for a monarchy desperate to maintain its myth of perfection. Even within the family, epilepsy was often treated as a shameful secret. There were no public statements, no well-meaning charity appeals, no acknowledgement at all. Prince John simply began to disappear. Letters, diaries, and court memos from this period hint at the unspoken grief and tension. Queen Mary, a woman famed for her stoic reserve, kept her anguish firmly private. A confidant later recalled how Mary would refer to her youngest son as "my dear boy," in soft, affectionate tones, though she spoke little of his illness to anyone beyond the family circle. The Queen's diaries, meticulously kept, rarely mentioned John after 1911, a silence more telling than words. George V, though a strict and often aloof father to his other children, displayed a particular tenderness towards John. Known for his blunt, no-nonsense manner, the king was never an especially demonstrative parent. Yet, with his youngest son, there was a curious softness. One courtier recalled that George would look the other way when John misbehaved and allowed him freedoms denied to his siblings. It was said within the household that the king could not bring himself to punish a boy who faced such daily torment from his own body. As John's seizures worsened, his formal education suffered. Tutors reported that while the prince remained spirited, often curious about the world, his capacity for structured learning was increasingly limited. He struggled with reading and writing, frequently losing concentration. Yet, in more relaxed, informal moments, when free from the expectations of royal decorum, John showed flashes of wit and warmth. He was fascinated by nature, drawn to animals, and adored mechanical toys, particularly his collection of model trains. It was in these moments, in the company of his beloved nurse, Charlotte Lala Bill, and the household staff, that John could still be a boy. But the royal household, ever conscious of appearances, could not ignore the inevitable. In 1913, with the prince's seizures becoming more frequent and severe, a decision was quietly made. No new official portraits of Prince John would be commissioned. Photographers tasked with capturing family groups were instructed to exclude the young boy. Family outings, parades, and state occasions proceeded without mention of the king's youngest child. John's name was omitted from newspaper articles chronicling the royal family's activities. It was as though he had begun to vanish from the public record. Within the palace walls, the family sought to maintain a sense of normalcy. Queen Mary was reportedly attentive in private, though her upbringing and the demands of her position limited how closely she could care for her son. She entrusted much of his daily life to Lala Bill, the formidable and deeply compassionate nurse who became John's closest companion. Lala was known for her fierce loyalty and unfailing kindness, the one adult in John's shrinking world who treated him not as a royal liability, but as a child deserving of love. Meanwhile, George V continued his duties, his visits to his youngest son becoming less frequent as war loomed on the horizon. By 1914, with the outbreak of the First World War, the king was consumed by military and imperial responsibilities. Though family life always took second place to matters of state for George, the growing distance from John was also a reflection of the era's discomfort with illness and imperfection. By 1916, with Britain entrenched in a devastating global conflict and the monarchy navigating political and social upheaval, the family faced an unavoidable decision. Prince John's seizures had grown both more violent and unpredictable. The risk of a public incident, even within the protected confines of Sandringham House, was too great. His fits could come suddenly, in the nursery, the gardens, or even during family meals, and the sight of the convulsing prince was deeply distressing to his siblings and staff. That year, a fateful choice was made. Prince John would leave Sandringham House and move to a more secluded residence within the estate's grounds, a modest red-brick dwelling known as Wood Farm. Originally built as a home for the estate's gamekeeper, it had long been used as a residence for minor royals or visiting guests. But in 1916, it was quietly repurposed. No formal announcement was made, no notice appeared in the court circular. Yet to those within the palace circle, it was clear. Wood Farm had become Prince John's exile. Wood Farm, though modest by royal standards, was comfortable and surrounded by peaceful countryside. Its isolation was both a kindness and a sentence. A flock of chickens, a pet pony, and the family's dogs became his constant companions. The boy who might have ridden in coronation processions and attended state banquets now spent his days walking through meadows, playing with toy trains, and listening to Lala read to him by the hearth. And so, as the world outside descended into chaos, Prince John's story quietly receded into the background. His name no longer appeared in the court circular. His face vanished from official photographs. In Wood Farm, the young prince, now a slender, wiry boy of 11, would spend his remaining years sequestered from the prying eyes of both society and his own family. Within the family, John was spoken of delicately, his absence explained with vague references to fragile health and needing the country air. His household at Wood Farm was small but carefully appointed. At its centre was the indomitable Charlotte Lala Bill, John's governess, nurse, and most devoted protector. A woman of unwavering loyalty, Lala had cared for the young prince since his earliest days and had followed him into seclusion without hesitation. She ran Wood Farm with gentle authority, ensuring that, though isolated, John's life was as comfortable and stimulating as possible. She read him stories, tended his cuts and bruises, and devised small adventures to distract him from the relentless unpredictability of his illness. Alongside Lala, there was a devoted tutor, a steady-handed coachman, a kindly cook, and a pair of discreet maids. The staff was carefully selected for their discretion as much as their skill. Wood Farm was not merely a home, but a carefully managed secret. One courtier later described it as a satellite with its own little household on an outlying farm of the Sandringham estate, orbiting the grandeur of the main house, but never quite part of it. Visitors to Wood Farm during the Great War years were few and closely monitored. Those who did catch glimpses of the prince recalled a slender pale boy with a mop of light hair, often found in the garden with his loyal dog by his side. One wartime guest remembered watching John from a distance as he sat cross-legged in the grass, stroking the spaniel's ears and murmuring to himself about aeroplanes and battles. "He was like a secret prince from some old fairy tale," the visitor wrote, guarded by his own retainers, walking alone. Despite the physical and social isolation, efforts were made to provide the boy with small joys. His grandmother, Queen Alexandra, herself growing frail in her widowhood, took a tender interest in John's well-being. She ordered a special garden to be planted near the cottage, filled with bright flowers and hardy vegetables. It became one of John's few sanctuaries, a place where he could dig in the earth, chase butterflies, and lose himself in childish daydreams. It was named, in gentle deference to him, Prince John's Garden, and he tended it with enthusiasm. John's world at Wood Farm was small but vividly textured. He doted on animals, keeping a collection of hens, rabbits, and ponies. His drawings, many of which survive, revealed a boy enchanted by the natural world. Birds in flight, fields of wildflowers, and imagined airships soaring above the trees. Ever since the early days of the Great War, he had developed a fascination with zeppelins, believing they would someday land in the meadows beyond his window. Lala encouraged these harmless fantasies, often helping him construct elaborate models from bits of string and paper. Yet beneath this pastoral idyll lurked the reality of his illness. The seizures remained severe, sometimes striking with little warning. There were whispered accounts, likely exaggerated by local gossips, of John being tethered by a short leash to Lala's wrist on difficult days to prevent him from wandering or falling during a fit. Though no official record confirms this, royal letters hint at the ever-present anxiety over his safety. Even routine carriage rides to London or visits to Queen Alexandra's house were undertaken in strict secrecy, the carriage windows tightly curtained to shield John should a seizure strike in transit. As the months passed, the sense of isolation deepened. By the end of 1917, the prince who had once tumbled through the bustling nursery at Buckingham Palace now lived almost entirely alone. His siblings, now teenagers and young adults, were consumed by war duties and royal obligations. The court circular remained silent on his existence. Rumours circulated in Norfolk villages about the hidden boy at the farm, though few ever caught more than a fleeting glimpse of him through the trees. Queen Alexandra, increasingly heartbroken by his solitude, urged the family to arrange companions for John. Letters from her during these years reveal a mixture of affection and sorrow. In one, she lamented, "Poor Johnny longs for a companion. I fear his world grows too quiet." In response, Queen Mary discreetly arranged for local children to visit Wood Farm. It was a careful, managed operation, the children selected for their health and discretion, sworn to secrecy by their parents. Among them was a bright, cheerful girl named Winifred Thomas, the daughter of a local tradesman who had been sent to the countryside for the sake of her own delicate health. She quickly became one of John's favourite companions. Together they chased chickens, played hide-and-seek in the garden, and made up stories about imaginary kingdoms. It was, by all accounts, the closest John came to experiencing the rough-and-tumble camaraderie of schoolboy life. Yet even these small joys were tempered by caution. The risk of a seizure hung over every game, and Lala never let John stray too far. On bad days, when his fits left him exhausted and frightened, the household would fall into a hushed, sombre mood. Lala would sit by his bedside, reading from The Water Babies or The Railway Children, while his dog curled at his feet. Wood Farm was a sanctuary, but it was also a cage, a place of gentle comforts and suffocating seclusion. For Prince John, It became the entire world. A small corner of Norfolk where he could be neither prince nor patient, only a boy chasing butterflies beneath a sky of drifting clouds. Throughout Prince John's short and troubled life, one constant presence remained by his side. A woman who became his lifeline, his protector, and his steadfast companion. Charlotte Lala Bill, a gentle yet formidable woman, was far more than just a governess to the frail prince. She was the only mother he truly knew, the one who understood him and cared for him in ways that his royal parents could not or would not. Lala Bill's bond with John began long before the prince's seclusion at Wood Farm. In fact, when John was just an infant, Lala had already established a reputation for her kindness and attentiveness. She was entrusted with the care of all the York children, the future King George VI, Princess Mary, Princess Alice and their siblings. But it was John who had become her singular responsibility. Even as a young child, John was marked by his fragility, and it was Lala who first recognised the boy's peculiarities. She had been with the royal family long enough to see the signs, the slower growth, the odd hesitations, the strange spells that no one quite understood. It was not long before Lala's quiet affection and devotion toward the young prince became apparent. Her gentle, nurturing presence in the nursery was something that set her apart. Even as she cared for the other York children, she seemed to develop an almost intuitive understanding of John's needs, a sensitivity that would become even more crucial as the years wore on. In the early days of John's life, Lala's role had been to nurse him through ordinary childhood illnesses. But as John grew older, the challenges became more pronounced. By 1916, when the decision was made to remove John from the public eye entirely and send him to the remote retreat of Wood Farm, it was Lala who was asked to accompany him and stay by his side. Queen Mary and King George V, increasingly overwhelmed by the responsibilities of their reign, entrusted John's day-to-day care entirely to Lala, a decision that was as much a matter of necessity as it was one of deep trust. It was in the quiet, secluded world of Wood Farm that Lala's influence would truly shine. No longer just a governess, Lala became the prince's constant companion, caregiver, and protector. Life at Wood Farm was a delicate balance of routine and crisis. The staff at the farmhouse, including the tutor, the coachman, and the kitchen maid, were all part of the bubble that kept John shielded from the outside world. And it was Lala who kept everything from unravelling. She had become not just his governess, but his de facto mother. Lala's dedication was unwavering. She understood John in ways few others did. His epilepsy had grown more severe over the years, and each episode left him more vulnerable, more fragile. Yet to Lala, the boy was always her charge. She was his anchor, his safe harbour in a storm of illness and isolation. During the long, painful seizures, she was the one who held him close, offering the only comfort she could provide as his body shook uncontrollably. One account described how Lala held him tightly while he was shaking, her soothing voice whispering words of comfort as though trying to ground him amid the chaos of his body. When the seizures subsided, she would nurse him back to health, her tireless devotion evident in the smallest of details, from bringing him his milk to soaking his brow with cool cloths to relieve his fevered temperature. There were days when it seemed the illness would take everything from him and from her. In Lala's diary letters, written in those quiet moments when she was able to find some respite, there are traces of the exhaustion she must have felt, but no complaint, only concern for John. She never wavered in her care despite the overwhelming challenges. "He is my charge," she wrote in one letter to a friend. "No matter what happens, I will stay by him. He is so sweet and so brave, but I fear for him more than any of the others." The isolation that came with living at Wood Farm was compounded by the increasing emotional distance from the royal family. As the years wore on, the visits from King George V and Queen Mary became fewer and farther apart. It was not out of lack of love for their son, but the necessity of maintaining a royal facade. The king, stoic and burdened with the responsibilities of ruling an empire at war, refrained from seeing John as often as he might have liked, and Queen Mary, although deeply concerned, was caught between her duties and the heartache of seeing her youngest son so frail and helpless. In Lala, however, John found not just a caregiver, but a constant, loving presence that never faltered. Even as the boy's health worsened and the seizures grew more frequent, Lala stayed beside him, providing the stability that John so desperately needed. She became the only constant in his life, even when the rest of the world seemed to disappear into the distant corners of war and court politics. It was Lala who became the first to realise that something had gone terribly wrong on the night of January 18th, 1919. As always, she had spent the evening beside John, talking with him softly, trying to ease his fears as he struggled to sleep. But when she checked on him the next morning, it was too late. The seizures, which had come with increasing frequency, had taken their toll. John lay lifeless in his bed, his small body cold and still. Lala's grief was unspoken but deeply felt. She had been with John through every crisis, every moment of pain, and now she had to face the unimaginable loss of the boy who had become her own. It was Lala who made the fateful phone call to Queen Mary, breaking the news that no mother ever wishes to hear. Lala Bill telephoned from Wood Farm that our poor darling Johnny had passed away suddenly. Queen Mary later wrote in her diary, the words filled with sorrow and a deep, lingering sadness. Within moments, the King and Queen were racing across the Norfolk lanes, desperate to reach their son for one final farewell. They arrived at Wood Farm to find Lala, standing by the bedside of the boy she had loved and cared for, with tears in her eyes. In the moments that followed, Lala's role as the silent guardian of Prince John was forever sealed. She had given everything to him, her time, her energy, and her love. And when it mattered most, she had been the one to ensure that he was not forgotten, that his passing was not hidden from those who needed to mourn him. Though her name was not as widely known as that of the royal family, it is clear that without Lala Bill, Prince John would have lived an even more isolated, forgotten life. Lala was not just his governess. She was his heart, his protector, and his silent guardian. And for that, she deserves to be remembered as much as the prince himself. Royal reactions, siblings, and parents. The shock of John's death rippled through the family in unexpected ways. To his older brothers, Edward, Albert, the future Duke of Gloucester, Henry and George, John had always been a mystery, so at once gentle and strange. His seizures could upset them in frightening ways. Lala admitted later that, "We dare not let him be with his brothers and sister because it upsets them so much with the attacks getting so bad." Yet memories of John in happier times remain. When Edward and his brother Bertie came to visit at Wood Farm, Edward once fashioned John a wooden cart and they both disappeared from view joyfully, rolling together across the fields. Even Princess Mary, the only girl, loved to romp with her baby brother. Indeed, the New York Times obituary observed that John was the favourite brother of Princess Mary, who loved to romp with him. In private, the royal parents were devastated. Queen Mary, always discreet, poured her grief into her diary. Her entries after John's death are unbearably poignant. On hearing the news, she wrote, "A great shock, though, for the poor little boy's restless soul. Death came as a great relief. It was at once heartbreaking and compassionate. Mary knew how cruel life had been to her boy. She broke down when she saw him, very resigned but heartbroken, lying peacefully in his bed." In the days that followed, Mary confided to friends how grateful she was that John has been spared much suffering, describing his passing as "no pain, no struggle, just peace for the poor little troubled spirit." King George, too, was sorrowful. He later called John's death the greatest mercy possible, acknowledging that this gentle prince had long been very ill. Not everyone understood their sorrow. The oldest sibling, Prince Edward, handled the tragedy with astonishing callousness. A private letter he wrote to Queen Mary shortly after the funeral was blunt and cold. He termed John more of an animal than anything else, and said his death was little more than a regrettable nuisance. Realising the cruelty of his words, Edward begged his mother's forgiveness, apologising that no one could know how little poor Johnny meant to me who hardly knew him. It was a shameful lapse, one the Queen remembered with silent pain. In contrast, the presence of Sandringham villagers at the funeral. Every single person on the estate, standing around the gates, flowers covering the humble grave, comforted the grieving parents. Queen Alexandra, John's beloved grandmother, wrote softly to Mary that now our two darling Johnnies lie side by side in the churchyard. She herself had known only too well the heartbreak of losing an infant grandson, and her words were a balm. John's namesake, his uncle Alexander John, had been buried here 15 years earlier. Prince John died on 18 January 1919 at Wood Farm after a prolonged seizure, ending his 13 years of suffering. The news was announced quietly. The Daily Mirror later reported that when the prince passed away, his face bore an angelic smile, and it was the first to publicly acknowledge that epilepsy had been the cause. On 21st January, a simple funeral was held at St. Mary Magdalene Church in the Sandringham grounds. Only family and estate staff were present, filling the small church with sorrow. Queen Mary noted that the service was awfully sad and touching, and she personally thanked each of John's loyal servants. Even in that grief, Mary showed tenderness. She spent the morning of the funeral signing copies of her young son's favourite books, inscribing them in memory of our dear little prince, and later gave them to John's friend Winifred Thomas. She also gifted John's slate chalkboard to the daughter of a Sandringham gamekeeper, a humble token for the hard-working people who had cared for her son. These gestures spoke louder than any obituary. A plainly engraved tombstone now marks Prince John's grave, bearing only his name and dates and nothing more. In the years after, the royal couple seldom mentioned John in public, but they kept his photographs, letters, and these personal mementos close to their hearts. Queen Mary's very last diary entry mentioning John was simple and mournful. "Miss the dear child very much indeed.